Hey guys, it's Django here. Hope you're well. Today I thought it would be cool to take a look at programming some funky glitch hop drums like this. You don't have to like the type of music, but there are plenty of useful tools in Reaper for manipulating audio in the arrangement directly rather than inside a drum machine. Not everyone likes to produce like this, but there are guys like Mr. Bill who use it to great effect. And even if you're not using it for drums, you might still find these workflows useful. So now the first thing I would recommend doing is setting up shortcuts for your grid settings. So at the moment, we're looking at 16th notes. I can toggle between 1 bar, quarter notes, 8th notes, 16th notes, triplets, and 4 bars. And I also have a frame grid for when I'm editing video. So those are all quite useful. The other useful thing is I have a toggle mapped for swinging the grid. So if you look carefully at the offbeat 16th notes, they're moving a little bit. You right click the snap button and then you can adjust the swing grid settings. So you'll see the lines over here. You'll see them moving. You can give it negative or positive swing values. So for these sort of funky drums, they're often almost triplets, if not triplets, pretty heavily swung drums generally. So it is useful to be able to toggle that swing grid using a keyboard shortcut. The other obvious one is the default is Alt-S to toggle snap, which I still have in use. So those are all handy things to have. And we're going to look at some other useful tricks as well. But first, let's pull in a drum. So here's a kick. And now you'll notice when I drag it in, we don't have any little fades at the beginning and end of the sample. This is because I switched them off. So if you go into your preferences, under media item defaults, you switch off create automatic fade in or out for new items with a specific length. I've switched that off. I also don't have it cross-fading items when they are sliced. If I want to cross-fade something that I've sliced, I'll just slice it and then I'll drag with snapping off, or one of your modifier keys, I forget what the default is, it might have been shift, bypasses the grid temporarily, and as soon as you overlap 2 items, by default they crossfade. So I have any automatic fades off. In Ableton you can do the same thing, and that means that your drums will be as punchy as they were when you previewed them. So now let's say we want to sequence a bit of a beat. I created a little groove here earlier. I figured it might be useful just to have some sort of a melodic reference. So I might want to put another kick here. So obviously you can drag it, figure out which modifier key gives you the little plus symbol, and then while you hold that modifier key, whether it's Shift or Alt or Control, these things are all customizable, and I customized mine years ago. So you could either copy like that, or what I tend to do is Marquee Select, which is that little selector, and time select at once. And I do this with a right-click drag. So now, firstly, that is a custom thing, but it's very easy to set up. If you go into Preferences, Mouse Modifiers, you'll see here Context, Arrange View, Right Drag. And then the default action for just right dragging without holding Shift or anything is Marquee Select Items and Time. So if we go in here, Marquee Select Items, and set a time selection. You can also do it ignoring snap, so maybe if you want to do that while holding Shift, you could bypass the snap if you want. It's up to you. But what's handy about that is you get to select your items and a time selection, and then using a shortcut, I've got it set to D. The action was duplicate selected area of items. It duplicates both the area you've got and whichever items are selected. So if I only have part of an item selected, and I duplicate that, you'll see it's only duplicated that tail end of whatever was selected. On the other hand, let's say I have those two selected, but not that one, and I duplicate, you'll see that it's kept my time selection, but it hasn't duplicated the one that wasn't selected. So that's very handy for quickly sequencing drums. If I want to duplicate the bar, I just do that. Now, the cool thing about sequencing audio in Reaper in particular is it's quite easy to manipulate a bunch of samples at once or replace them down the line. So, for example, if I now grab the end, I can drag them all and shorten them. And if you create a fade without holding down any modifiers, it just fades that one sample, even though I've got others selected. But if you hold Control and Alt and drag, then it does it to all of them. I believe that's Command Option on a Mac. So that's also quite handy. So I can sort of shape all of the kicks at once. And I can easily replace them down the line by just right-clicking a sample and saying Use as media source for selected items. So now we've got snares here instead. I'm going to undo that. And let's create a bit more of a sequence here. Now to turn some of them down like these, I can grab the item volume envelope on the item and turn them down. Cool, let's get a snare in there. So here's our snare. One thing to bear in mind, like now if I go to quarter notes, they're also swung unless I turn the swing grid off. So you do have to be a bit aware of that when you're editing. Can also use actions to move items around, which is super handy. Let's add a drum loop and see how we can mangle it. So here I have this sort of nice hip hop breakbeat sample. When I drag it in, you can see that it's at a different tempo from our project. So it looks like it must be about 4 bars, but at a slower BPM. So if you go to the edge of the item and try various modifier keys, you'll see one of them gives you this little grab handle. And with that, we can sort of shrink or stretch the sample. So let's make it 4 bars and see if it's in time. Let's group our drums quickly. I have a little custom action rather that adds this folder and then returns to my previous selection. So I can just drag them straight into the folder. All it is a track with no effects on it at 0 dB, and it's red. That's all there is to that track. Perhaps I want this section looped. So I'm just going to paste it in there. And again. So now this sounds quite nice, but we could go further with this drum loop and mangle it a bit. So what I'm going to do is select it all, and if we go into view, dynamic split, we can basically slice it as if it were like a Rex file, for example, in Reason, where you have each slice being a different drum hit. So you can see it's detected the transients fairly well. The little red dotted line is where it would theoretically slice it. So this looks like a bit of a miss trigger. I don't really see a sample there. Let's have a quick listen to it. So I would call this 2 slices rather than 3. So let's try and reduce the splits. And there we go. It's taken that away. So let's select all of these, and you can see here action to perform, split selected items. You can also set your transient sensitivity in here. I'm not going to touch it since it seems to be working fairly well for me at the moment. And I'm just going to hit split. So now it's sliced this loop at each sort of transient, at each hit. Now sometimes you hear a little click where it's sliced it not quite at the right space, or sort of not exactly in a gap in the sample. So you could combat this with little fade outs. So again, I was holding Control and Alt. You could now use these slices to sort of rearrange them. So what you might want to do is just add another track and mute that one, and then just choose bits and pieces from the other loop and place them wherever you want. But for today, what I'm going to do is try and mangle these samples some more. So because we time stretched or compressed this loop, you can see that the rate is above 1, meaning that it's being sped up. Anything below 1.0 is slowed down, and anything above is sped up. If we go into the item properties, I pressed F2. You can also get to it by right-clicking and going item properties. What you can do is come back to 1.0, which is playing back at original speed. So now all of these slices are going to play back at their original speed, even though the slices, the sort of transients, are still in the right place on the grid. So if you've done quite a drastic change in tempo on the loop initially, this is a nice way to sort of get your initial transients to sound normal again. However, this is open to some abuse. So what if we change the playback rate to something like 0.4, so less than half the original speed of the samples? That's an interesting sound. We could take it further by changing the pitch. So perhaps we want it to go up like 6 semitones. Let's see what that sounds like. And then we could also experiment with different settings to get interesting granular sort of effects and textures. I'm quite a fan of this sound touch. And if you go into fast mode, it sounds different as well. Various different settings you can experiment with. So that's pretty cool. And now we can shorten each of them as well. Now we've got a completely new sounding loop. So it might not be the best example, but it is something to experiment with if you like interesting, weird textures. Let's return to project default and 1.0 speed. Let's hear it in the mix. Let's try 2 semitones up. Or 1. I'm going to go into my Splice folder and search percussion. So let's just search perc. That could be interesting. I'm just going to drag new samples in and we'll experiment with them once I have a few. Cool, so we've got a couple of sounds here. Cool, so we've got some percussion. Let's say we want to pitch this up or down. I have keyboard shortcuts for pitching up and down samples. So you'll notice that the sample's actually speeding up and slowing down, as well as changing pitch. The way this works is through an action. So I have them mapped to 5 and 6. Decrease item rate by a particular percentage, and then it says in brackets 1 semitone, and it also turns off preserve pitch. Same goes for the increasing pitch. So if we look at the item properties now, you'll see that preserve pitch when changing rate is turned off. So when we change the rate, the actual pitch changes. And so with the right rate change, you can change it by a semitone. And they've obviously worked out exactly what percentage that is. So it's quite a handy action to have just to pitch samples around. So maybe we want to stretch the sound, make something different out of it. First, we're going to need to preserve the pitch. So what I'm going to do is just join it quickly. So now it's rendered. Let's reverse it. Change the pitch. stretch this as well. So a useful thing with reversed sounds like this is you can move the snap offset marker, which is this little symbol here. So if we, this one, see it says snap offset. What this allows you to do is snap the sample when you move it. Instead of to the start of the sample, it'll snap to somewhere in the middle of the sample or the end of the sample. So if we move it to the end of the sample, or there even, now when I move the sample, it's going to snap to the end. And you can actually see that that line is sort of made bold. So that's quite useful for reversed samples. And when you pitch them, they stay synced relative to that snap offset. So for example, if I pitch this down now, you'll see that it expanded this way instead of that way. Let's imagine we want to glitch this sound out. We could manually duplicate it. So the action for that is simply item duplicate items. But now because I've created an odd length, this is not going to snap to the grid. It's literally just duplicating. So now I could grab these and make them fade into each other. Do a little bit more. And now I'm going to glue them together. So I'll use glue items. And now it's rendered them as one file. And now we can do things with stretch markers. So if I add a stretch marker and then another stretch marker, if you grab just before the middle of this, you'll see that it goes up and down instead of horizontal. And then on the left side of it, on the right side of it, you get the up and down as well. What this allows you to do is create ramps. So now it's basically stretching this sample. If we turn off preserve pitch, you'll actually hear it kind of working like a tape stop. So that's pretty cool. We could also duplicate this and then select just those snares on the new track and replace them with some other snare. Use as media source for selected items. Create some fade outs. In fact, maybe shorten it altogether. Except these. Let's try pitching it up. Cool, and the drums on their own. Hope you guys find that useful. Thanks for watching. Cheers.